Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nicci MacLeod from the Right and Wrongs podcast.
This episode contains descriptions of murder by stabbing.
We'll explore themes related to gang violence and knife crime, and there will be some swearing. Listener discretion is strongly advised, as some content may be distressing.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques played a role in unravelling the truth behind these tragic events.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Series 1, Episode 5, Foreygensic, Lingeyguistics, Cracking the Killer's Code.
Hello, and welcome to Righting Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, here at Aston University. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr Nicci MacLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL.
We described in a previous episode what forensic linguistics is. How does this case that we're going to discuss today fit in?
We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. And we talked about how there are these kind of two areas of forensic linguistics. There's this area around kind of improving the legal system. So sort of making various stages of the legal process, looking at the language there and thinking about what obstacles that might present to people that encounter the legal system. And we also mentioned that we look at individual cases. So we work with the police or with defence solicitors or whatever it might be, where there's a question of language related to a particular case. That could be criminal cases or civil cases. Now, sometimes in those cases, the question is who wrote this particular text. So if you've got a ransom letter or a blackmail letter or threatening letter or whatever it might be, the question there might be what sort of person wrote this text. It could be that there's a suspect or several suspects in mind about who wrote a particular text, and our expertise would be drawn on to comment on who the more likely author is. But sometimes the question is about what does this mean? Not who wrote this, but what does this mean? And that could be around what we call pragmatic force. So given the words that were uttered on this particular occasion, is this a case of somebody threatening someone, for example? So we'd be called on to comment on the force of what was said at a particular time. Sometimes we comment on non-standard varieties. So there might be a word or there might be a phrase or a string of words and phrases that wouldn't necessarily be easily understandable by a jury. And so the linguist's job in that case would be to provide some kind of gloss, some kind of interpretation of something that's been said, because it would be outside what we would reasonably expect a jury member to have. And I know you've worked in that area before.
Yeah, sort of slang interpretation cases.
So in this case, we're talking about a disputed meaning case, but rather than it being, what you might call slang or a sort of typical kind of non-standard variety that wouldn't necessarily be understandable to a jury, we're actually talking here about a very deliberate attempt to obfuscate or to hide the meaning of what's being said.
So one reason we're featuring this case, Nicci, is because you were the expert witness in this case, and it's a very interesting case. But why we picked on this case out of others that we might have chosen?
This case is it's a very tragic case. It involves the murder of a young man, a 21-year-old, as we'll hear in just a second. And it's probably the most interesting case that I've ever taken on from a linguistic perspective. Very interesting. It was one of those cases that I thought was hopeless and that had a real sort of eureka moment that just ended up kind of unfolding as a really sort of landmark case, I guess, in my career. This was featured on BBC One Expert Witness. So if just to do a shameless plug there, Series 4, Episode 4, Cracking the Killer's Code. That was me. I think we're going to probably get into quite a lot more detail today than they were able to fit in onto that programme. But this is the case. And it centres on this specific language game. It involves speakers, which in this case were obviously the murder suspects. They were inserting a particular syllable into words to disguise the content. And this is obviously something that people might be aware of, kind of pig Latin from the playground. It's something we associate with children.
And we've discussed this, and in my experience, horse Latin, we called it. And it's all inserting different consonants into a word to make it obscure.
Yes, it is. And so for children, it's obviously to obscure the fact that they're up to no good from teachers or parents or dinner ladies or whatever it might be. And in this case, like I say, we're talking about murder suspects who are trying to disguise the content of what they're saying from the police, who they had very strong suspicions were probably earwigging.
And the variety we're talking about we might call egg Latin, because the syllable inserted is a version of the word egg.
Yes, that's right. And so we are going to come to some examples of this conversation, and we're going to sort of get to grips with how I tackled it and how I was able to sort of uncover some of what was being said. We're also going to look a little bit about how visual analysis of sounds can help with interpretation. So we've got sort of numerous tools at our disposal as forensic linguists, and one of those is being able to actually visually analyse sound, because every sound it looks different on a spectrogram, which I'll explain what a spectrogram is a little bit later on in the episode. And we're also going to be looking at how there are kind of multiple layers of interpretation. So in this case, yes, it was obscured with this Egg Latin language game, so that obscured the content of what was being said. But then even once that level had been kind of deciphered, there were still some words that were not standard English. There were words that are associated with a variety that we call urban British English.
Yes, so this is the street speak, for want of a better word, that a lot of listeners will be familiar with. It's sort of associated with urban centres, but has spread throughout the country, originally called multicultural London English, and drew a lot on Jamaican and Jamaican English and other varieties.
We're going to come back to that and discuss that in a bit more detail. So let's open the case file.
In the early hours of the 23rd of August 2015, at a party in a community club on the outskirts of Gloucester, a fight broke out between a group of men who travelled up from Bristol and some local Gloucester lads. During the altercation at the All Nations Club, one of the Gloucester men, Elijah Sutherland, was stabbed in the arm, leg, back and hand. Elijah's friend, 21-year-old sports shop worker Dolton Powell, intervened and was also stabbed. He later died of his injuries. Using CCTV footage, the police traced a car that left the scene and went back to Bristol and managed to ID some of the occupants. Soon they had 10 suspects in custody. The scene outside the party had been one of utter chaos and confusion. It was dark, the weather was bad, and there were many witnesses, but often with confused and conflicting accounts of what had happened. To make matters worse, the CCTV footage was blurry. The police recovered a knife from nearby, but they were struggling to link any of the suspects with the murder scene. During interview, the men all stayed quiet, responding no comment to all questions put to them. The police applied for an extension to the men's custody time, and this meant transporting them to the magistrates' court and back in small groups in the back of police vans. The police had an idea. If the men wouldn't talk at interview, perhaps they would talk to each other on the journey to and from the court. With authorization, they fitted covert recording equipment into the vans in an attempt to capture the men's conversations. On listening to recordings, however, the police had a problem. Some of the conversation sounded like it wasn't in English. It was in what police described as a code. There were sections that were in standard English and were easy to understand, and these sections made it obvious that what they were talking about was the night in question and the attack on Dolton. Police approached the host of this podcast, Dr Nicci MacLeod, to try and uncover what was being said in the so-called coded utterances. Nicci established that the suspects were using a language game known as Egg Latin to obscure the incriminating content of their conversations.
We're going to be hearing some audio clips from these covert recordings of the murder suspects. Do you want to expand a bit on how the recordings came about?
I believe there were 10 suspects in custody at one point. They were all interviewed. They all gave no comment interviews. And the police, and I'm going to give a shout out to DC Sophie Ferguson, who obviously played a central role in this case. And an idea that she had was that, well, if they're not going to actually engage with interviewers and divulge any of the information of what they know and what happened on the night in question, then perhaps they want to talk to each other. They obviously haven't seen each other since they've been arrested. They've been kept in separate cells and they've been interviewed separately. So perhaps what might encourage them to open up is actually seeing each other again. And so it's with that in mind that they were being transported back and forth between the police station and the magistrates' court as applications were being made to extend their custody. I can only keep suspects in custody for 24 hours before charging or releasing them. And in order to extend that, they needed to be taken in person to the magistrates' court. And it was those journeys that the police thought, well, this is the ideal opportunity, really, to see if we can capture them interacting with each other and potentially sharing details of the night in question. So they installed these covert recording devices into the vans, and this is the source of all the audio clips that we're going to be hearing today and that we're going to be discussing. So, as we just heard there, the conversations were not easily understandable. It wasn't a case of just playing it and thinking, oh, great, well, we've basically got confessions here from all of them. That wasn't the case. A lot of what they were saying was obscured. What became very clear on listening to recordings is that they had a hunch they were being recorded. They knew that this wasn't really a safe space to be talking completely frankly and openly about their involvement in what had happened. And so that's what led to them obviously purposefully kind of trying to disguise what it was that they were saying.
Let's turn to listen to one of the first extracts that might be potentially incriminating. Our listeners are going to have to listen hard because these are covert recordings, and some of the background noise and some of the quality isn't so great.
Yeah, and let's not forget they were recorded in the back of moving vehicles. So yes, they were covertly recorded. The suspects were probably quite aware that there was a chance they were being eavesdropped on. So they were obviously speaking in a fairly kind of lowered tones. And yeah, this is all contributes to it being quite difficult to follow, but it is possible. So listen carefully.
As you've demonstrated in your transcript. Let's go to the extract.
I remember shouting, "Get the thing." I swear down that was me, but I only said that because obviously I was kind of, I wanted to shoot them lot.
That's what I see. I know.
Someone's actually a big ass snitch, like. What a bastard.
No, they're remembering everything.
Yeah, someone was there sober. Someone probably watched the whole thing, but guess what? That's not fucking enough. They better have us on fucking camera. Perks. I don't feel it on my bagel. I don't feel it on my bagel. Obviously we'll find out, because obviously they're saying that a couple bottles were recovered from the scene, but there was bare bottles.
What bottle?
Basically I had a bagel in my hand, yeah. When the gun was getting knocked.
So having heard that, our listeners are going to think that's terrible quality audio. You and I know, Nicci, that a lot of covert recordings, that actually counts as quite good audio. And yes, and certainly you were able to listen to that. This is the task. You were able to listen to that and produce a transcription that you considered accurate enough to become evidence in the case.
Yeah, that's right. So as you say, a lot of the time when we're asked to provide our interpretations of recorded audio, it's much worse than this, believe it or not.
And quite often what we have to do is mark up sections as being inaudible or unable to transcribe, because what you've got to be careful of is not listening too hard and creating a transcription from something that you can't really hear in the text. We might come to that in a future episode in more detail, but for now, this was good enough to create a transcript.
It was, and I should say as well that I was provided with a transcript that the police had produced based on what they thought was happening in these conversations. And I think it's important to point out that we should, as forensic linguists, we can't rely on police transcripts. We need to actually approach it with fresh ears and not to be primed by a transcript that might have been produced by let's face it, you know, that the police would have been wanting to sort of establish that there was something here that was of use, and so it wasn't going to be a completely kind of neutral approach to transcribing it.
So there's whole areas of forensic speech science research which looks at this kind of transcription problem and in terms of confirmation bias. The police will hear what they want. Confirmation bias created by the fact that you've been given a police transcript, you've got to put that away and forget it.
Yes.
And listen just for yourself. So with all those caveats about the difficulties of forensic transcription, tell us what was in your transcript. What's going on in this conversation?
Okay, so it's probably useful for me to just sort of pull out a few bits from here and sort of explain what I got from it and what I transcribed. So starting off here with the first speaker talking about, it says, I remember shouting, "Get the ting." I swear down that was me. And we have some kind of laughter and sort of overlapping talk for a bit. And he says, I only said that, because I wanted to shook them lot up. Someone's actually a big ass snitch, like, what a bastard. The other suspect says, yeah, they're remembering everything. Go back to speaker one. Someone was there sober. Somebody probably watched the whole thing. But guess what? That's not fucking enough. They got to have us on fucking camera, pricks. I don't know, fam. I don't think they've found my bago. Now, this is the first occurrence of the language game.
Yeah, and I noticed that he first says it, I don't think they found my bago. And he says that in a soft intonation. and then someone expresses incomprehension or that they haven't quite
the
heard.
second speaker
The second
says,
speaker,
yeah.
a second time he says it, he says it with emphasis. And for me, that's a communication that I'm switching into the language game. I'm switching into the code. So he says, I don't think they found my bago, in that way of I'm communicating more than the words are saying, maybe.
Obviously, we'll find out, because obviously they're saying that a couple of bottles were recovered from the scene, but there were bare bottles. What bottle? Basically, I had a bago in my hand yet when the Don was getting knifed. Now, we've got a couple of items of urban British English in there. We've got bare bottles, meaning many. We've got the Don was getting knifed, as in the man, the sort of main man, the head man. And another thing that's interesting about this is that we've got being used interchangeably the term bago and bottles. It's very clear from the context here what bago means, because it is being used interchangeably with its standard counterpart with bottles. So that's obviously what's being referred to.
So if this isn't a cipher, is a code, and there's a different, you're not decrypting in that code breaking sense, but what you've got there is a key to the code, in that you've got a word bottle, the referent bottle, both in its standard term and then in this form that they're using in this language game.
Yes, most of this extract is in fairly standard English. There's not a whole lot of this language game going on, but we do have this one item, and this is maybe the first step.
Help you understand what's going on.
Yes.
This is what let you in.
That's right. So, like I say, what we've got there is mostly fairly easy to understand if you can hear it, if you can kind of get past the quietness and the background noise and so on. What's there is actually mostly standard English, and it puts them at the scene. They're talking about witnesses, they're talking about CCTV, they're talking about how some of the witnesses have been obviously talking, and they're talking about someone being knifed. That's very clear at the end of that extract. They're talking about bottles at the scene, as we heard there. I had a bago in my hand when the Don was getting knifed. Don, as I said, referring to a man, and bago, as we've just established, is being used interchangeably with bottle. So yeah, we can kind of get to the bottom of what's being said there. So this puts them at the scene, but it's not particularly incriminating. Just shows that they were aware that something had been happening at the time.
And in that extract, like you said, most is in standard English, so it's fairly easy to understand.
Yes, but in this next clip we're going to listen to, things get a bit trickier to follow. So give this one a listen.
We ran full support. Remember when you first come into the figures cake or paper can?
Yeah.
We was fucking Jacobs to pick up to fucking make me to the take and vehicles you.
Yeah, the one was
And
going.
then fucking remember Haggy Baker, Jacob Shaker.
Take one.
No, remember Haggy, Jacob Shaker.
He got it.
So this is clearly harder to make out in terms of standard English. Nikki, what are we hearing there?
Yeah, so the language is a bit more difficult to follow, or a lot more difficult to follow. We've got something along the lines of Jagos the Bay got to fucking Magos to the Dagan Magos Megu, which sounds like utter nonsense.
And you're entirely fluent, which I love.
They all know, yeah. That sound, egg, is being inserted into mainly stressed syllables, so it might be worth explaining a little bit what we mean by stress. In any word that's polysyllabic, that's got more than one syllable, there will be one of those syllables that will have the primary stress on it. So if you take a word like linguistics, then the stress is on the second syllable, it's on the gwis.
So this idea of stress in syllables is used a lot in poetry with the idea of meter. Blank verse, Shakespearean poetry is often an iambic pentameters, and pentameter, that means 5 stresses. So there's 5 stresses in each line, and the poet constructs the words together to hit that dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum
Right.
of a iambic pentameter.
Yeah,
But
this is
so
when-
all words have stressed syllables and unstressed syllables, and what you're saying, what you heard eventually,
Yeah.
skillfully, is that it's not only that you get this repeated sound, but within a particular word, it occurs in a particular place, and it's on this stress syllable.
That's right, in the stress syllables, yeah. So it's stress being all sort of part of the rhythm of language, the rhythmic kind of
And
nature.
just to say, in other languages like French, stresses work very differently,
Right.
and Italian stresses work differently. So
Yeah.
so this is how stress is patterned in English is a function of the English language, and in other languages they function in
Yeah.
different ways. But
Yeah. But it can actually have an effect on meaning. So in English, it can make the difference between the verb record and the noun record.
Stress can carry meanings like that, or it can be just part of how the words come out.
Yes. So go back to syllables. All syllables are made up of an onset and a rhyme. So it's fairly self-explanatory that the rhyme is the bit that rhymes. So pet rhymes with bet because the rhyme of those two words is the same. It's et. But the onset, which in that example would be the p or the b, this is between these two elements of a syllable that the egg would be being inserted.
Okay, so between the onset and the rhyme within a syllable and in the stressed syllable. So this is really quite fine-grained analysis. And nobody is suggesting, of course, that the speakers are thinking this. Oh, which is the stressed syllable?
No.
Oh, what's the onset? What's the rhyme? I'll have to say egg there. As in all language, people become fluent, they become competent in the language production. And then as linguists, we can sit back and analyse what's going on. It's not something that we do as producers of the language. It's where the sort of the science of linguistics is. We can examine it in the abstract and say, well, this is how this functions. And so it may be semi-conscious. Obviously, they're consciously using the code, but they've learned relatively fluently how the code functions.
Yeah, that's it. And these are rules, not in the sense of you must do this, but these are the rules that are being followed when somebody is using this particular variety, this particular language game. These are the rules that govern that particular language game. And this is what I was able to identify. You're right, the speakers wouldn't be able to necessarily articulate what those rules are.
There's that internalized version of the language user. And then there's what we develop when we learn to become academic linguists is what we sometimes call meta-linguistic awareness. So awareness of how the language works. And you were able to analyze the user's output and develop your own rule-based system of how this was being inserted.
Yeah, that's right. So bearing in mind that we've established then that egg is being inserted between the onset and the rhyme of some stressed syllables. So we're kind of getting towards kind of explanation of what's going on here. Just want to go back to that same recording and just take an element of the sort of early part of that recording. So we've recognised that egg is being repeated throughout the talk. And one of the first phrases I'd sort of tested this theory on was this that becomes at the start of the extract. So play 3.
Figures, keyboard, paper. Figures, keyboard, paper.
Okay, so if we've established that it's egg being inserted between the onset and the rhyme with some of the stressed syllables, let's take all the eggs out of that extract. So,
and again.
So using audio editing software, many brands are available, I've removed the eggs from that particular extract. And what we're left with is this. It sounds like first car park. I don't know.
Can we play it again to... Okay, so you've now primed me to...
Yeah, I have.
First car park, and that is indeed what I'm able to hear. But you were doing this without that transcript in front of you. You were doing it to write the transcript, and you were able to come to some degree of certainty that would be a reasonable interpretation of what was said.
It sounded like first car park to me. And then, because I knew where the incident had taken place, I had a look on Google Maps at the All Nations Club where this had happened. And sure enough, there were 2 or 3 car parks that you need to pass through between leaving the road and actually getting to the All Nations Club, where Dolton was killed. So that kind of provided me with a little bit of support for my hunch.
So there's 2 things going on here. You used the contextual information from Google Maps. And we've already said that linguists are wary of confirmation bias when making transcriptions. When you told me that you'd heard first car park, I was able to hear it.
Yeah.
But let's just, our producer Sam has been playing with this phrase. So let's just listen to his recording in the egg Latin of the phrase first car park.
Fegust, kegar, pegarch.
Okay, clearly that's
Much clearer
than the original.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then what Sam has done is he has done what you did, which was to clip out the egg sound.
Yeah.
And let's hear Sam, our producer, voicing this.
First, car, park.
Okay, so you can hear that's an edited clip, but it's much clearer than what you came to at the end of your audio editing. Let's just for comparison, let's go back and listen to extract 4 again, the original clip. Okay, so you heard that as first car park, and that's what went into your transcription. So you didn't have a transcription in front of you, so you weren't subject to the first sort of confirmation bias. Someone had told you that. But having examined the maps online, you saw that there was 1, 2, 3 car parks and that this was the first car park. So that made contextual sense.
And I didn't do that until after I decided that what I could hear was first car park. And I
Okay.
did that as backup to
Okay.
yeah.
And I think that also brings up another sort of principle of semantics, principle of meaning in linguistics, which is that all meaning is contextual.
Yeah.
If you cannot understand a word, you look at the context of its usage. And that context can be the words that surround it, or it can be where in a conversation it occurs, or it can be in that broader context. And so what you did, you came up with your transcript, like you said, before thinking there might be a car park involved. And then you found contextual confirmation. This was a reasonable interpretation of this.
That's right. And there's context in the conversation as well, because it's clearly a location that's being discussed, because he says, when first coming to the Pegas Hagar. So this adds a bit more to that conclusion as well.
We've got to be wary of confirmation bias and use contextual meaning warily, but it will help in
It will help. Yeah, that's right.
So tell me a bit more about what's going on here then in this clip.
Okay, so despite the police had said this is a code, and I guess what we would say the technical name for what's going on here is a language game. We might also want to describe it as a cant. And these are designed specifically to render speech unintelligible to outsiders. We mentioned at the start there about how we usually associate it with the children in the playground trying to just sort of disguise the mischief that they're up to.
So I think, and you've already mentioned this, but when we hear kids on the bus or anyone, groups of people, and they're speaking in a dialect we don't understand, or in a sub-variety of English we don't understand, which might involve a lot of slang words that we don't follow, that's not necessarily an attempt at deliberate obfuscation.
No,
But for this kind of language game, that is the purpose of it. And it's not the only time we see this in the development of language.
Yeah, in terms of examples of other language games that people might be familiar with, I did mention at the start Pig Latin. Let's just give a bit more detail around that. So this is where the words are altered by moving the onset. So we've talked about what we mean by onset before. So this is the initial consonant of a word, moving that to the end of the word and adding a. So Pig Latin, the phrase Pig Latin, becomes ig pe atin le. One that's more popular in the US is a language game called Gibberish, which is formed by adding idig into each syllable. So if you wanted to say I love cats, it would be idigai lidigav kidigats. Something along those lines.
Okay.
So,
and so what gets inserted, there's a range of language games in this, and I've said that I was aware before this case of horse Latin where you add nay into the word. So I think on the stress syllable in the version that I was aware of. There's a history of this stuff. It's not that these individuals have made up this language.
No, that's right.
They've acquired it probably in a school playground. And also, for me, that they're called Pig Latin and Horse Latin and so on, and Egg Latin, suggests a kind of like public school history, which I think is interesting, particularly when you're talking about these aren't public school kids.
No, that's right. But interestingly, the label wouldn't have been applied by them. I don't think they call it Egg Latin. Somebody's come along and kind of sort of put that label on it, and I guess kind of making it kind of cohesive with Egg Latin and Horse Latin and all those kinds of things. So it actually has nothing to do with Latin, which I think that very, very clear, but that's the label that's been attached to it. It's not just called Egg Latin. It's got, there are alternative names, Egg English, Eggy Peggy, Eggy Peggy. There are a whole list of alternative names for it, but we'll stick with Egg Latin for now. So picking up on one of the points you made there about how they probably acquired it in childhood. These lads had grown up together, so they've spent their entire lives communicating with each other, and presumably spent their entire lives having things that they wanted to hide from outsiders, and so they've just kind of continued to draw on this variety. The van journeys were obviously the first opportunity they'd had to see each other. And they, like I said, probably had a very strong suspicion they were being listened to. So it makes perfect sense that they would draw on this particular.
So we talk about someone's language resources. So from childhood, these individuals had this as a language resource, which they're now taking advantage of in the context of being in the back of a police van going to court, being at least half aware or suspicious that they're being recorded. And so they draw on this sort of childhood language game. Do you want to talk about other areas where this language game or language games like this have been explored in the linguistic literature?
It's been explored in lots of contexts, actually. Cants, they've attracted a lot of attention from linguists over the years. One particular area is that of Polari. So this was a cant that was originally used by circus performers, and it kind of incorporated elements of rhyming slang and Romany words. That was later adopted by members of the gay community. So this was at a time when being gay was a criminal offence. And members of the community obviously wanted to signal their identity to other members of the community, but without attracting an unwanted attention from outsiders, particularly police officers or whatever it might be.
So not unlike the suspects in this case, the language was used to be deliberately obscure. That's what makes it a cant rather than just a sub-variety of English. And also performs maybe an in-group, out-group identity function.
Yeah, they would have been able to recognise other members of the community. They would know who they were safe to be open with based on the use of this cant. So Polari, that's where we get the word naff from. So there's
and there's quite a lot of words that have moved into standard English from Polari.
Yeah, there are. So Paul Baker is the source for that. He's written a book on Polari. So that's the further reading for the listeners.
Excellent. We've established then how this variety of language is built and some of the linguistic background to it, and that first car park, this phrase that we've been focusing on in some detail, has placed these offenders at the scene of where the stabbings occurred.
Yeah.
But otherwise, in and of itself, just being there isn't that incriminating. So what else was in the conversation? Talk about more of your transcript and what you were able to find out.
So it's not in and of itself very incriminating. Lots of people were there. There were lots and lots of witnesses, and this in itself doesn't tell us anything really about these speakers' involvement. But the point is, we know the rules of the game now. Now that we've worked that out, we've kind of established this is what's going on here, so we can apply the rule that we spotted there to other elements of the transcripts or of the recordings. We can get to the bottom of what's being said. So we can listen now to a potentially more incriminating segment.
But he had his steak at pretty good vegan.
What a ledge.
Because I remember when he
times the guy went pom, and he ran off.
That's what I'm saying. I remember clearly the guy going to poke him once. Once I seen him go poke him once. That's when I made you to the day and he goes 80.
What are they talking about here then, Nikki?
Well, the very first bit of language game that we hear in that extract is Stegab Preguf Aegon. So I'll just pull that out as an example of something to focus on here. And what they're talking about there is if this is something that someone had on. So they said, is Stegab Preguf Aegon? And the other speaker says, did he have it on? So we're clearly talking about something that you can wear. We can apply the rules that we already have established to this particular extract. And of course, we'll do the same thing. We'll remove the eggs. The phrase itself is this. And if we want to remove the eggs, because we've established that looks to be the rule.
So I think I can hear that without your prompting. Stab proof on? Is that what you've got?
Stab proof on is exactly how I transcribed that. He's talking about, bear in mind what I've already said, this is clearly something someone's wearing. He's got his stab proof on. He's talking about someone wearing a stab proof vest. Generally, stab proof vests aren't kind of considered usual party attire. It's not what I wear to parties.
I think I can say I've never worn a stab proof vest to a party.
Yeah.
Or indeed at all, but there you go.
Well, no. Well, over at West Midlands Police Museum, you can try them on. They're very heavy.
Oh, yes. I might have worn one briefly then.
Yeah, so unless trouble was planned or at least expected, there's no justification for wearing a stab proof vest to a party.
Absolutely. So let's move to one last extract with some potentially incriminating content.
So we've got something like the Reged Nege at Mine Man, the Bleged Fegel Egoff. I've got to say I didn't get anything for the first bit of that. I don't know if maybe with more careful listening now and all the wonderful technology we've got for enhancing the quality of recordings and so on, maybe I would. But certainly what I did get something for was the second part of this. We've got Bleged Fegel Egoff. The blade fell off. Take the eggs out of Bleged Fegel Egoff. Blade fell off. So they're talking about a weapon that was used in the attack, and in fact a weapon that was actually recovered from the scene. They did recover this knife.
Okay, so those last two bits about wearing a stab-proof vest and talking about a weapon, this is now discussing the crime itself. So this is the incriminating.
Now we do have some incriminating material, yeah.
So you've solved the case for us, Nicci. Is that case closed? Where are we at?
Not quite. So, as I kind of mentioned earlier, after this kind of decoding, for want of a better word, what I could of sort of the language game, and that wasn't all of it. I have to say that I was not able to provide glosses for anywhere near the full amount of language game.
So, just as we said, just for transcription from standard English, doing forensic work, you have to be really willing to write inaudible. You were willing to write, I cannot transcribe this portion. I've no idea. I don't know what it means either. So your transcription was partial against that audio.
Yes, absolutely. And we've heard from some of these extracts how fluent these speakers are in this particular language game, and this the speed at which they talk sometimes, the fact that any successful language game, if it's actually doing its job as a cant and disguising it, in these inserted sounds are going to affect the quality of the sounds around them. So even with the audio editing software and removing those eggs that have been added, if what's left has been affected by the fact the egg was there in the first place, it's still not going to be easy to understand.
So let's just focus on that a bit. What we know in standard English, in any language, that when you have a part of speech in the middle of a word, you get co-articulation effects.
Yes.
So what you have in the word forensics, you've got the N sound in the middle, but the N I have in the middle of forensics will be different because it's preceded by 4 and followed by 6. That will shape that sound forensic. So if I just chop the N out, I'll be losing some of the 4 and some of the 6.
Yeah.
And so that's called co-articulation. And the same will occur for these eggs or eggs in the Aston examples. You're losing some of the actual words as well. And this reduces the interpretability of the clipped out audio. So that's one explanation as to why you might not be able to transcribe it all.
The example I like to use is the word hamster. So a lot of people think when they spell hamster in writing, they put a P between the M and the S. And the reason that they think that is because when you say it, you basically produce a P sound because you're moving your articulatory equipment, your lips, your tongue and everything from the position of producing the bilabial M to producing the alveolar fricative S. And so in the process, in bridging the gap, what you're doing is actually producing a P. So that's why a lot of people write it down.
And actually in terms of developing spelling over, decades or centuries, some of these get fossilized into spellings.
They do.
So a favourite example of that for me is you get frogs and newts in your pond. Yeah. So a newt used to be called in Middle English ewt, E-W-T.
Okay.
But because it attracts the an rather than it turned into a newt rather than an ute. So these articulatory things feed into spelling,
They do.
But they're all examples of this co-articulation effect.
Yep.
So if in audio editing you're trying to take out one sound out of the middle, the point we've been making is you take out more than just the sound you're trying to remove, and you miss some of the co-articulations, and that's maybe just one reason, but that's a big reason why there will be whole passages of this that just remain uninterpretable, even with your careful listening. And just to tag on to the end of that point, I think it's a really good example of caution as someone working on forensic cases. So we cannot fill in the gaps. So if you were trying to produce a transcript for some other purpose, say for a lecture on this to your student group that wasn't to do with forensic linguistics, you might produce a much fuller transcript than you could swear to in court.
Yeah, I only wanted to be so confident, a certain level of confidence that would lead me to actually producing a gloss for something. And if I wasn't sure, it wouldn't make it into the transcript. So this was a big reason for lots of it being undeciphered. But though, even from what I was able to decipher, some of what was left was, or some of what was remaining after the eggs had been taken out was still not standard English that everyone would necessarily understand. And I think we've got an example of that to listen to now.
It was leg even, and then I went done that, and then we back. But you see, man, that was what the last thing that happened before.
But that's what I'm saying. See, man, I just only remember fucking gay getting naked in the wig. Baby told me to gay get in the wig, of gay got in the wig these times. Make up, wig it, tuck the wig in the day go. Boom, I opened the day go, me girls to stay got the cake got. Don't she if they we got two guys then me girls trying to drive off. I've got out as he's trying to drive off and run over my leg. This time I remember it, but I don't remember it to like view it, you know what I'm trying to say?
So you've removed the eggs from that speech, Nicci, from that audio at least. And once you've done that, are you then, or are we clear on what it is they're talking about, what they're saying?
Not completely. So just to sort of recap over that clip a little bit, it starts off, he says something along, he says, was leaving. So take the egg out of that, was leaving. Okay, makes sense, was leaving. And then, see, in my mind, that was the last thing that happened before we left. That's what I'm saying. In my mind, I just really remember fucking gay getting Maggie in the way gip. Wavy told me to gay get in the way gip. I've gay got in the way gip. So let's pause on that little point first. I've gay got in the way gip. Wavy told me to gay get in the way gip. Any guesses on that?
No, you've lost me.
I've gay got in the way gip. Wavy told me to gay get in the way gip. Saying it a bit slower for you. Any?
No, I've got absolutely no idea, Nicci. So yeah, let's try one more time and I'll listen hard.
I've gay got in the way gip. Wavy told me to gay get in the way gip.
No, you're going to have to help me.
So we'll take the eggs out.
Yep.
I've got in the whip. Wavy told me to get in the whip.
Okay, so I'm better at this now. You've taken all the eggs out, because I know full well what a whip is in slang or urban English. A whip is a name for a car.
Yes, I believe originating from the fact that a whip was used to drive the horse on a car.
That's it.
Apparently so.
Apologies, great. Yeah.
So whip is a term used in urban British English meaning car. So we've got this whole kind of other layer of interpretation. I'm going to pull out another example that we've heard from that clip. These times, Megar and Megar Megit at the Wagon Dago.
Let's see if our listeners can do better than me. Say it again slowly.
Again. Megar and Megar Megit at the Wagon Dago. Megar and Megar Megit at the Wagon Dago.
No, I'm beyond me.
Let's take the eggs out. Ma and Ma meet at the window. Now, let me give you some other information. This group of suspects included someone called Martel and someone called Marzel.
Okay.
I think they're talking about those two individuals, Ma and Ma.
Yep.
And they meet at the window. So they're talking about the process of this altercation that kind of broke out. Again, we're looking at two very fluent speakers. You heard from the speed of that and just the fluency with which they were talking. But yeah, crucially, what we've got here is even once we've removed all those eggs, we've got certain items like whip, for example, and we heard in an earlier example, Don. We've got Dagon, took the egg out of that, and we've got Don. And again, we're looking at an urban British English item there. So there's a whole other layer of interpretation to do, even once the egg Latin is solved.
Absolutely. I've done some work on cases involving urban British English.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it as a sort of source of creativity in the English language. And it starts with multicultural London English, or so it was named back in the early 2000s, multicultural London English, and sort of observed and discussed as that. And what that captures, I think, is the waves of immigration into London. So if you think of the East End of London, we associate that with Cockney.
Mm-hmm.
And Cockney itself, and particularly the rhyming slang, but there's other words in Cockney which represent waves of early immigration in the 20th century. So you get Yiddish words in Cockney, like something being kosher.
Kosher, yeah.
It is quite a nice example of that. And then obviously you get, during the war and then post-war immigration, you get layers and layers, particularly the Windrush generation. So this is where quite often people talk about multicultural London English as if it's Jamaican, or Jamaican English as it's sometimes referred to, or a patois. I've had lawyers ask me to interpret items from the patois. And as linguists, that's not what we mean by patois. But you get these varieties of English. And then more recently, I've noticed items representing later waves of immigration. So, for example, I've had texts where I've been asked to help interpret where the word kosher has been replaced with the word halal, which is really interesting. So that represents Bangladeshi or subcontinental immigration into the UK post-war and so on and so forth. And we would expect, I guess, that the most recent big wave of immigration into London would be Eastern European immigration. So it's a really rich part of our English language heritage. And the other thing to say is, so we've moved from multicultural London English to the phrase you've been using, urban British English, because it's clearly not restricted to London. We've been talking about people in Bristol. It's seen in all the big urban conurbations. And in fact, Jack Grieve, who works at the University of Birmingham, studying these kind of items in online texts like Twitter and so on, has shown that it's not restricted to urban areas either now. So they'll have to scrap the urban out of and let's just call it British English. It's a variety of British English.
Yeah.
And this is part of what we study of linguists, and as forensic linguists across the board there, that we can be asked to court to help decipher. So beneath your layer of egg Latin, you've got a variety. So the police in the case probably understand this variety pretty well, urban British English well. But the concern for the prosecution is that there will be members in the court, whether that's the judge or the jury, who cannot understand these terms. And that's where the role of the linguist can come in to help people understand what was said.
Yeah, and that's our role, isn't it? It's to help where something might be expected to be outside of the jury's understanding or knowledge, then it's our job as an expert witness to assist in that.
And we might pick up other cases which really focus in on this variety, I guess, later in the series. I've had a few, you've had one or two.
I've had a couple.
And then there's a growing controversy about miscarriages of justice surrounding the translation and interpretation of drill music lyrics, which I think will be a great topic to cover in a future episode.
Just sort of still talking about this variety then, because it's got all these influences from kind of Caribbean, has influences from Caribbean kind of patois, has influences from Africa, from the Indian subcontinent and so on. One term that I've heard, we've talked about multicultural London English, urban British English. A more kind of widely understood term I've heard is Jafaican. That obviously the implication being there that white kids using this variety are somehow inauthentic or something. Yet, of course, it's shared by all kind of ethnicities across.
Absolutely. So I was involved in a case where a very specific item was used, which does come from Jamaican English, the term to duppy someone.
Okay,
and the word duppy originates in Jamaica, and it's a sort of a name for a sort of a ghost or a sort of partially undead person is a duppy. And Bob Marley has a song, Duppy Conqueror, and there's now a beer that I've tasted recently called Duppy Conqueror, presumably after Bob Marley.
Yeah.
But back in about 2008, the word duppy was used in a case, and I was asked to decode what duppy meant. And it was quite hard back then. It wasn't in common usage in MLE when I was doing this analysis. And the phrase was, I'll get a fiend, a drug fiend, I'll get the fiend to duppy her den.
So being used as a verb.
So being used as a verb by analysis ended up to mean to turn into a ghost, to kill someone. And it was a conspiracy to murder case. But what was interesting in that case, I'm building on your point that it's not, this Jafaican thing. The suspects, and in fact the guilty parties in that case, because they were convicted by the court, were of Nigerian background.
Right.
Yeah, so they had nothing to do with Jamaica.
Yeah.
So you might use Jafaican against young white kids, but these were young African descended men. So you get this. It really is British English. It's not the variety that's spoken on the streets of New York. It's very different from what was AAVE, African American Vernacular English. Quite different from that. And there's crossovers, and there's some quite nice rap songs where you get American rappers discussing through the rap the differences and similarities between the two languages.
Yeah, but not restricted, but to ethnicity, not restricted really to urban areas, as you've just said, and I think not restricted to the working class as perhaps that was at some point.
And I guess also that the point of all these sub-varieties we're talking about, rather than the codes of the language game, is that if you're outside of the community that uses this language, it seems to you like a code.
It seems as if they're purposefully trying to keep you out.
But these items aren't that. And hundreds of thousands or even millions of people will be speaking these varieties. But if you're not part of that community, it doesn't sound like English to you. But it is just a variety of British English.
Yeah.
So we've talked about urban British English. Do you want to talk a little bit about the other techniques that you were using to help decipher this language, other than the simply listening hard technique?
Well, there was a lot of listening hard and repeated listening, and putting it on a loop and listening very carefully with headphones. But as we've said, it's very poor quality audio. Can't always tell what the sounds are that we're listening to. The police had already produced a transcript, and you've got to be obviously very careful. Try to ignore that as much as possible and not be too swayed by it, because you will convince yourself that what you're reading is what you're hearing. which isn't necessarily the case. But there were sort of some elements where, I looked at the police transcript after I'd produced my own. I was sort of looking through where there were inconsistencies. And there was something that they'd transcribed as waygu that I'd transcribed, I've just heard this bit, waygip. I was sure I could hear the p at the end. But I thought, well, I can't be absolutely sure just from listening. So what I did was to use a piece of software called Pratt, which allows you to visually analyse sound through looking at spectrograms. So a spectrogram is this kind of visual representation of sound. It's got various areas of differing shades of black and grey, and that represents particular elements of speech. And each element of speech, each sound that we produce as speakers looks very different on a spectrogram. So this was kind of one sort of tool that was quite useful. So we've got certain vowel sounds. This issue of voicing is probably quite important to kind of explain what we're looking at with the spectrogram. So we have some voiced and some voiceless sounds.
So that the intensity of the voiced sound, so if you take k, meaning the C sound, what people think of the C sound, and g, you make them in the same place in your throat, but the g is voiced. And k is largely voiceless. It has a very late voicing onset time. So you can say it without feeling your voice box vibrating. If you put your fingers lightly on your neck and say k and then g, you feel more vibration in your voice box from the g sound.
Yeah, so this is what we would call a minimal pair. In pretty much all regards, these are identical sounds, but where they differ is with voicing, and another minimal pair being p and b. So people at home could try this. Put two fingers on where your Adam's apple would be, and say bit, and then compare that to pit, and you'll notice that it's vibrating on the b but not on the p. And these are, again, that's the difference.
And so that intensity of voicing shows up really nicely on the spectrogram.
It does. So all vowels are voiced by definition. It makes no sense to you have an unvoiced vowel. Any vowel sound you make, you're going to feel that vibration. So vowels are represented on a spectrogram by a very thick black line at the bottom. So the horizontal axis representing time, and the vertical axis sort of representing different frequencies of the sound. So this is why every sound will look different on a spectrogram, and it gives us a bit more information about what we're actually hearing. And a p is very distinctive on a spectrogram. You can see the spike, you can see the release of air, the burst that comes from producing a p. And when I looked at this particular segment on the spectrogram, it was very clear that yes, there was a p, and my transcription of waygip was the right one.
So you've supplemented your hard listening both with the context for the meaning, and then also with the spectrographic analysis. You've looked at the spectrogram, and you can see some of these consonant sounds as being definitely present. And on the end of waygu, you have the p that you can see. You take the egg out of the middle, and that turns into whip, which we've just heard is a name for a car.
Yeah.
So this is overall a fascinating case, as we've discovered that I would have been very bad linguistical in this case. I'd hope to do as good a job as you, but
you gave me this case.
I did. I think I passed it up because I could. I think, to be fair, that was before I'd heard any of the tapes. I didn't know what it was. But you're right. I did. I think I passed this case on to you. Presumably, I was busy with other stuff. But so, how common do you think it is? I'd not heard of a case like this before it came through.
Yeah, and I thought it was incredibly rare. I'd never heard of anything like it before. I didn't expect to ever hear of anything like it again. But a few months later, I had another case that came along, different police force. And the recording they said they had a woman, she was on remand awaiting trial for murder. And she was speaking on the phone to her sister. And the police had suspicions that the sister had been involved in this same murder, but she was currently on the outside. She was at home. And so they're speaking on the phone. And I got the very similar instruction. They're speaking in code. We don't know what they're saying. Can you work it out for us?
So we're not going to do quite as much detail on this case,
No.
but let's just listen to a couple of extracts on this one.
A shellaboo, bellaboo, thelaboo, relbus, yellaboo.
So again, it's amazingly fluent, isn't it? It's fantastic.
Yeah. So that's the sister on the outside. This is the one that's not in prison, but which the police have got their suspicions around. And what she's saying is something like a shellaboo, bellaby, thelaboo with yellaboo.
A shellaboo, bellaboo, thelaboo, relbus, yellaboo.
Something like that. So this time, the sound that's being repeated is an egg, but well, I don't know. Can you pick up what that sound is? It's being said.
A shellaboo, bellaboo, thelaboo, relbus, yellaboo.
Yeah, there's a lot of b in there. Leb.
Eleb. If we take the elab. So I thought that seemed to be segment that was being repeated. Shellabid, Bellabid, Delabed with Yellaboo. Take the elabs out of that, and we've got I should be there with you.
Oh, so this is someone who's not in prison saying, I should be in prison.
I should be there with you. Yeah. So potentially, I mean, it could just be a sort of, just a kind of sisterly love. It could be that actually I should, yes, technically
Sure.
I should be in there.
So let's listen to the other
Yes,
half.
the other sister, I've got to say, so that was the sister at home that we heard. And the other one who's in prison, she's actually, if you thought that was fast, wait until you hear this. And we hear her speak in the next. So it's the same sister first, so the one at home first, but then listen to the imprisoned sister, her response.
How about Yellowbit, just Scalabit and Delabon, Melbit, Delbit. Elbit, Delbit, Lily, Elbit, Delbit, Nelbo, Yellowbit, Elbit. Right. Really? That's exactly what I said to my gown. I was like, excuse me?
Like nothing, excuse
That is fantastic.
Isn't that good?
That's exactly what I said to my girl, and she said, "What? Excuse?" So yeah, that second sister is so fluent and fast. Were you able to help with that?
No, it's the short answer. Very quick, very fluent. I couldn't get a word down. It doesn't matter how much kind of audio software editing I did, how much visualization I did with spectrograms. We've mentioned before, a good language game is going to alter the qualities of the base content. And even though I could easily get rid of the elabs, but what was left was not recognisable. It was still garbled.
So if you're fluent enough and fast enough, as this second sister is in this case, this can defeat even your ears.
Even my ears, yeah. So, but what was interesting here is that the free sister, the slightly slower one, understood it perfectly. She had no problems with it. She goes, right, yeah. And they continue their conversation just, for a few minutes before they actually hang up. Probably as some of their sisters, they've grown up together. They were probably speaking this way to hide things from their parents from a very young age, and it's continued into adulthood. But yeah, sadly, this was a case that I had to turn down. It demonstrates that there are limitations, and that this is actually quite widespread. And I don't know. I mean, I've never come across another one since this, but yeah.
But well, after this podcast comes out, you can inundate it with police calls on this. So let's turn back to the Bristol case, the central case for this episode. How did that play out over time? What happens next?
I was called to attend court to give evidence in the trial, which was July 2016. That was at Bristol Crown Court. So this is sort of a year after Dolton's murder. It was a really complex case, and Gloucestershire Constabulary quoted in the media as saying this was the most complex case they'd dealt with since that of Fred and Rose West. So this was a very famous case in the early 90s where the bodies of 12 women were found in the grounds of this sort of house in Gloucester.
An infamous UK serial killer.
Yes, yeah. Now, yeah, it was a very complex case. There were lots of witnesses in this trial. Most of those witnesses were given special measures. So this is a provision that's made in the Youth and Criminal Justice and Evidence Act for special measures for particular categories of intimidated or vulnerable witnesses. So they can be entitled to screens, for example, so that they can't be seen by the defendants as they're giving their evidence and so on. Because in this case, there was such a risk of intimidation or kind of retribution by the defendants or by their associates. There's no special measures for expert witnesses.
You've got to stand up in the witness box.
Stand there in full view of these 6 or 7 defendants, all kind of looking down at me from a dock. This particular courtroom in Bristol Crown Court, the dock was sort of elevated, which is quite unusual normally with the layout of courtrooms. But yes, that was fairly intimidating. And so one of these defendants, Jordan Barclay, was convicted of Dolton's murder, and he received a life sentence to serve a minimum of 20 years. Another one of the defendants was convicted for the attack on Elijah Sutherland. So if you remember from the case file at the start there, this was who Dolton was trying to kind of protect and then got stabbed. So the rest of these defendants, had all been charged under the joint enterprise law. Now, I think we're going to probably coming back to that in another episode.
Yeah, let's leave that one for now.
Yeah, we'll have more to say about that. But the rest of the defendants were all cleared, basically. So we had one conviction of murder for Jordan Barclay and another for Nico Daly for the attack on Elijah Sutherland.
How crucial was your evidence, do you feel, and what other evidence was there in the case?
And they did recover a knife from the scene, and we had multiple witnesses, but it was dark, the weather was bad. I mean, it was a party, a lot of them were drunk, there were these conflicting accounts, there was a lot of kind of inconsistency there. Forensic linguistics was just one piece of the puzzle. Now, if you listen to my appearance on Expert Witness on BBC, the police officer there, Sophie Ferguson, talks about my evidence being really quite crucial. It's to be considered in the context of lots of the other stuff.
Yeah, I think it's well worth thinking about that point, that forensic linguistic evidence is never really the only evidence in a case. It's always part of a pattern of evidence which has to be put together with other pieces.
Yeah.
And so there's this sort of narrative of heroic outside experts, criminal psychologists or whatever, in media, in TV shows and so on, who are there to solve the case for the police. And that's really not the role.
No.
You can provide one bit of evidence that contributes
and
to
that
a
sort of
conviction.
supports a narrative that's kind of from other bits and pieces.
And you can never really know, because you can't get into the mind of the jurors, you can never really know how important it was in the case. But the police officers certainly thought that your evidence was a strong contributor.
They did, yeah. And then it puts me in mind of another case that I worked on a long time ago, where there was a case of blackmail, and they had the blackmail letters and they had their suspect, and my job was to compare the blackmail letters with the writings of the suspect and to comment on the likelihood that she'd authored them. And provided my evidence, and it was based a lot around sort of idiosyncratic spellings that seemed to be shared between these two sets of documents. And I gave my evidence, and then it transpired that she was convicted, and I thought, it felt quite good to be kind of have my analysis sort of vindicated. And then I found out that they'd found the typewriter that had been used to type those letters, and bearing in mind all typewriters are unique, they've all got a unique sort of calibration and so on. So the typewriter that had been used to produce the blackmailing letters was found in her shed, wrapped in bin bags with only her fingerprints on. And I think that might have been a bit more convincing than me saying, oh, she spells neighbours in the city with Niegh instead.
I mean, maybe not in this case that we've been looking at in this episode, but often for authorship cases, authorship analysis will only be used by prosecutors where there's not other stronger evidence.
Right.
Yeah. Because it's not that, it doesn't carry that much weight compared to your typewriter with the fingerprints and everything. I want to say in terms of our logo, blood splattered, but presumably that wasn't in fact the case.
No. So I mean, looking at that, watching the television program. Sorry to keep going on about it, but it was nice to get.
No, revel in it. That's what I say.
It was nice to get a lot of the background to the case, because obviously we try, as experts, we try and keep ourselves detached from the case and try and not get much background and keep that to a minimum.
Absolutely, certainly in advance, we're really aware of this problem of bias, confirmation bias. So we have a principle to find out as little about the case as possible, other than the language we're given. So and very often you don't get that closure of, and here's the rest of the case.
No, that's it. So you don't hear the rest of what happens at trial after.
No.
You go in, you do your bit, and then you leave, and you don't know what's happened. And sometimes they'll let you know what the outcome was, and so on. But watching that and seeing the sister of Dolton talking about her brother and how happy she'd been with the outcome of the case, and that was a little bit down to me. So that was kind of that felt really.
It does feel good, and this is why we do the work. In improving the delivery of justice. It makes you feel you have achieved that, whatever the outcome of the case. But by going to court and making a contribution that is solid and you're confident in, is about that. And this is kind of why we do this work. What about the experience itself of giving evidence? How was that?
Absolutely terrifying. I think it was probably. I've not done many court appearances. I think it was only my third, possibly, something like that. So to have these multiple defendants, like I say, all sort of staring down from the dock. As we said, I didn't have interpretations for everything, so I was kind of full of self-doubt, thinking I've not done a very good job because I've got all these massive gaps in the analysis that I've provided. But obviously, it's better to say I haven't got a clue than to guess and So because there were multiple defendants, there were multiple cross-examinations. Each of them's got their own barrister, so I could have theoretically been cross-examined 7 or 8 times, whatever it was. Turned out that didn't happen. I think it was just 1, possibly 2 that actually asked any questions. And then when the sort of third one stood up and said, I was never any good at Latin. I had no questions. Wasn't grilled 8 times, so that was quite a relief. But the one of the ones that did ask me questions began his examination by saying, "Is it Miss or Mrs. MacLeod?"
Oh, so Dr. MacLeod, how did you respond?
I glanced at the one of the court clerk, was also a woman, who was looking at me, and she just rolled her eyes, and I rolled my eyes at her. I said, "It's doctor," and he said, "I was just trying to get to the bottom of whether you're married or not." And I said, "Don't say that out loud."
And why is that relevant to your expertise as a linguist? Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
So,
The Societies are alive and well within the British
yeah,
legal establishment.
it really is. Yeah.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion, and I've learned a lot about the case. I knew you'd done the case, but there's more detail there. So thank you for that. If our listeners have a question, remember you can get in touch with us via email, which is writingwrongs, WRITING writingwrongs at Aston, ASTON.ac.uk. And if you email us, we're going to collect all your questions and comments, and we're going to shuffle through them and pick some to answer in a Q&A episode at the end of this series.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics here at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.